Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar on case studies and patient data agreements. This is the fourth webinar in our patient data and licensing webinar series. We have one more coming up. We'll let you know more about that later. We'll go to the next slide. My name is Kirsten Loita. I'm a partner here at Osage University Partners, leading our university relations efforts. Today, I'm so pleased to have Robin and Nila joining us as our panelists, and I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves briefly. Robin, do you want to go first?
Hi, I'm Robin Rasor. I manage the Office of Translation and Commercialization at Duke, just a long name for our tech transfer office.
Thanks, Robin. Nila?
Hi, I'm Nila Bhakuni. I'm the Corporate AVP of Baptist Health Innovations at Baptist Health South Florida in Miami.
Great. Thank you both so much for joining us today and talking about these case studies. We'll go on to the next slide. For those of you who are joining us through this series of webinars for the first time, this slide shows the other webinars that occurred in this series, as well as the final webinar that's actually going to occur next week, which is a review of the previous topics that we've had on what is the data, what can we do with the data, how are academic institutions licensing patient data. We're also going to have a discussion on GDPR that's come up in a lot of questions from people. And you can then ask any remaining questions that you still have perhaps on this topic, puts forward some ideas that people could be doing in this area as well. So we're really excited because 5 of our previous panelists will be coming together for this final Q&A webinar. If you have any questions about this, you can look the topic on LinkedIn or reach out to me to find out more. We'll go to the next slide. You can find all of our webinars on OUP's partner portal, and that is a resource that's available for our partner institutions. The researchers and their tech transfer offices will also have a recording publicly available via our YouTube channel. The slides will be sent out to everyone afterwards as well. So you don't need to ask about those. They will be coming to you as well. We often get a lot of questions on that too. We do encourage questions throughout the webinar. Please use the Q&A tool in the Zoom toolbar that's somewhere on your screen. For me, it's at the bottom of my screen. I will be reviewing those and asking them as they come up as appropriate. We did receive some questions beforehand. Some of those actually are going to be answered in the Q&A webinar next week because they were more appropriate for those. And then some we've incorporated to their prepared materials today. We do have, as I mentioned earlier, we do have other webinars coming up that may be of interest. We have the culmination of this patient data licensing series that I mentioned next week for the Q&A. That's on September 6th. We then have a webinar on fellowship programs for academic entrepreneurs. That's a new one. We haven't advertised it yet. We're going to have the materials coming out on that very shortly. That's going to be on September 28th. At 1 p.m. ET, so keep a lookout for that. And then October, we have our popular Ask a VC webinar series thing that we do yearly with 2 of our managing partners. We will be putting that one out soon as well. So come and join us on October 10th for our Ask a VC webinar. We'll go to the next slide. All right, a short intro on OUP for those of you who do not know us. We are a venture capital fund that partners with academic institutions to invest in their startups, typically by exercising participation rights available through their licenses. As a part of this partnership, the institutions share in our profits and receive programmatic support on tech transfer and academic startups. OUP is now on its 4th fund and has made investments in over 130 companies in all areas of deep science. We're very focused on deep science, and many of those companies have had successful exits either through IPOs or merger and acquisition. And we'll go to the next slide. This just gives you an idea of the areas that we invest in. Always happy to answer questions about the OUP model. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Robin. We'll go over to the next slide, and she'll be talking about a particular deal that Duke worked on.
Well, thanks for the intro. Many of you know me and also know that for a number of years, Duke has been, I don't know if I'd want to say the leader. One of my colleagues always refers to, you never really want to be first, but you don't want to be last either. But for a number of years, Duke has had a data licensing committee. We were one of the first universities to develop a data licensing policy. And because of that group, we really started, in particular management in our health system, really started thinking about how do we do a better job with the data that we have for some of the goals that we have? So today, what I'm going to do is talk to you about the Duke Inference partnership. And in keeping with the motto, we were not first, we were second. The first partnership is with Mayo. Many of you may have seen that. And more recently, Vanderbilt has announced a similar partnership with Inference. So my goal today is sort of to talk to you about how we did this and why we did this. Next slide. So many of you who work with your health systems, or if you have a health system, you know these are some of the things that keep your senior management up at night. A lot of these are kind of associated with conflict of interest and patients. But I think the other thing that we should all recognize that keeps our management up at night is the pandemic really did financially really hurt our health system. Oops, go back. It flew. Really hurt our health systems. They've lost a lot of money. There's a lot of burnout, both for the clinicians and nursing and staff. And so the health systems are really struggling with how can we be more efficient, more effective? How do we deal with the financial losses that we've had? So that's really what keeps them up at night. Next slide. So at Duke, I don't think we're that much different than anybody else, but we have some, very important principles related to patient data. And as you might expect, privacy is really important. If your patients don't trust that you are using their data in the appropriate way and maintaining privacy, that's a real issue. And then the goal of being transparent, not only with our patients, but also with our faculty and our clinicians about what we're doing with our data. And if we get revenue from the data, what's that revenue going to be used for? But at the end of the day, I think more and more, certainly at Duke, the health systems are understanding that it's really important to promote these medical discoveries, and how do we use our data to help in advancing a whole variety of advances, from making us more efficient in billing and predicting patient outcomes, and also eliminating all sorts of disparities. How do we make sure that these predictive models and AI and all the chat GPT stuff that people are talking about, make sure that it works appropriately with your variety of patients. So all of these things really are at the top of everybody's mind when we talk about how we're going to use our patient data. Next slide. Next slide.
And we're
there we go. So when we started, and this is kind of during the pandemic, when we started, our management started thinking about what do we do with this volume of patient data? And there were discussions about, collaboration with other health systems, lots of different discussions. And some of the top things that they spent a lot of time talking about is, are we comfortable doing deals? How do we manage our patient, perception and even the PR risk? And you saw some of those articles, are we comfortable being able to management? Are we comfortable that our faculty could be concerned about, well, what are you doing with this data? Will we still have academic freedom to use the data? What if we want to work with other industry, et cetera? And another thing that we don't talk about that much, but was the health system going to spend the money, the very considerable amount of money to digitize the vast quantities of patient data we had, and how much time was that going to take? How much money was it going to take? Could we instead work with a partner who would do that upfront financing of a lot of this digitization that's required if you're going to pool your data? And then, of course, as it comes with that, if you do these kinds of partnerships, are we comfortable granting a long-term license to one partner, and what are the considerations and the milestones and things like that? So these were the kinds of things that they spend a lot of time within Duke, within management, trying to decide, okay, how are we going to go forward with this? Next slide. So, our senior chief digital officer, a fellow by the name of a pediatrician by the name of Jeff Ferrante, really was very strong in terms of, we're not going to let the data, no matter what we do, the data is not going to leave the institution. It has to be behind, as he refers, behind glass. It has to be set up in a way that it stays at Duke, but other people can use it. Our faculty can use it. Other academic medical centers can use it. Industry can use it in a certain way. So this became one of the top principles in any kind of a partnership that we were going to do. Next slide. And it did take a village and a lot of time. And if any of you are thinking about doing some of these major deals, I feel like many of us at Duke feels like it was multiple years of our life. So this sort of shows you the funnel. Back in the late 20s, leadership started talking about this. Do we want to spend the money to digitize all this data? Do we want to partner with other academic centers? What do we want to do? And a variety of very high level people all across the School of Medicine and the health system got together talking about, all right, like I said, what's our principles? What do we want to do? What makes sense for the university and the health system? And they started talking to a variety of potential partners, and really did a deep dive, evaluating a number of them, what partnerships for us, what makes sense for us, who do we like working with, et cetera. Then by 21, a fair amount of management discussions and approvals. And then, as you might expect, the contracts took some time. And that was signed in mid 2022. And right now we've got internal FAQs that have been developed. A lot of the initial digitization is working, hoping to roll out the first use of the data for both outside industry and then also for our faculty and clinicians, hopefully in the fall, some of the initial data. Next slide. It was actually one of the most interesting negotiations and processes I've been involved in, probably because it was such a major deal for Duke. I don't think it would have happened if our chief digital officer hadn't really developed such a group of committees. He was like, we're going to do this, but we got to have all these different groups involved in the decision making, and lots of meetings with a lot of different people, a lot of high level people, but you can see the kinds of groups that were involved. Very important for our community, because we have a very diverse community, and it was very important that community relations were involved, as you might expect. And that's also communications, all the finance people, the clinical research people, because this is important to our clinicians. What are we doing with our data? What can they do with the data? As you might expect, the legal people were very involved, and our office was sort of in this legal side of it, but also some of the finance side. Of course, ethics, security and compliance. There's a whole architecture behind the system that had to be developed. So it was a very large group managed by Jeff, who was basically, we're going to get this done. Next slide. And many days, this is how it felt. I'm not sure which of the little people down around the bottom I am, but I was one of those little people. But it got done. And I think the other thing, just like our data licensing committee has resulted in, a lot of people across the health system and School of Medicine know each other a lot better than we did 3 years ago, because we spent an awful lot of time working on this. And during the pandemic, I mean, we actually had a lot of the negotiations done remotely. Then we had sort of the hybrid negotiations. It was complicated. Next slide. So this is just the last slide to kind of let you know how this is kind of working. Inference has its own proprietary proprietary technology that enables it to manage and sort of structure data, but the data that is available outside of Duke is all de-identified. So all of the data, like we said before, stays within Duke. The only data that goes out is de-identified. And if industry wants to use it, they're going to have to use it through the Inference partnership. Our faculty, our clinicians can use the data. They can use both the raw data and they can use, as they've always been able to use. And then, of course, they can go into the FCAP, which is this federated platform. They can use it that way. So the idea is that there's a big investment in putting all this data in one platform that can be used outside of Duke under certain constraints, and then certainly within Duke. And, I'm sure someone will ask, yes, there is revenue sharing with Inference related to this. But a lot of this is the vast investment to put this platform together, which we feel is advantageous to us as opposed to doing a lot of individual deals. So that's why we did it. And we're moving on and seeing how this all starts in the next year or so. So that's the end of, I believe that's.
I have a couple of questions for you. We'll see if any more come in, Robin. So you had that slide that showed kind of all of the different groups that were involved. Do you have an estimate of like how many people actually then were, basically touching and like doing the certain perhaps approvals or, blessings of, parts of this relationship and the agreement?
Well, I mean, there were, as you'd expect, and maybe you could go back to the slide, as you expect, there was an executive committee. So there were, and that executive committee, the steering committee probably only had maybe 10 people on it. We would meet. Boy, I feel like there were times where we were probably meeting weekly. And then there was an executive committee that would, this had to go to the board, the president, the deans, it had to go. Jeff would have to present this to the executive committee. All the different subcommittees would probably meet at times when we were really trying to close all this down. Monthly, different committees would meet at more frequently or less frequently, depending on where we were. So, for example, the communications people and the community people really weren't doing much until we were sure that this was moving forward and the deal was almost done. As you might expect, the finance people and the legal people were meeting all the time when we were negotiating the deal, and ethics and genomics more early. So it was managed. It really was managed well in terms of people would come and go, and then there would be representatives from each of this committee that would be on the steering committee.
And my next question is, so this is the kind of the group that made this all happen and come to fruition to the point of getting to the agreement. But we all know that a lot of the work actually comes after the agreement. And so could you just speak to what it kind of looks like now, as far as like the people that are touching, the parts of this, the agreement and how this is working?
So there are there's still a steering committee. It doesn't meet quite that often. Probably, I'm trying to remember how often, once a month. There are other committees that are very active now, in particular, the architecture, putting all, and thank God I do not have to be in those meetings, a lot of meetings related to where all the data is going. And if anybody's ever has IT background, the architecture behind the design of this thing is amazing, and pages, and it looks like some sort of building design. I'm not an IT person. All the, making sure that everything is de-identified and how it's de-identified and proving it's de-identified and how it goes in and how it goes out. So those groups are very active right now. Some of the first data that's being digitized are pathology slides. So that group's very active because that's one of the first, setting that whole system up. There's some genomics group that's very active. There's also a partnership group because as part of the relationship with Inference, we've already spun out one company, and there's a sort of a business partnership group that meets maybe once a month, sometimes internally and also with Inference, because our faculty and our clinicians are coming up with ideas of collaborative research that they want to do, or partnerships, which is part of the interest that Inference and Duke had in this. So that group gets together fairly often to talk about, okay, various collaboration projects. So it's you know, it's always changing based on the needs that we have.
But I think that really gives people a good idea. Like, this is not something, this is something that really it takes a lot of involvement and commitment from an institution to do. But obviously, you know, Duke's not the only one who's obviously entered into such a relationship, and they consider this to be an area of a great importance. We do have another question from the audience about how much time did this take from start to finish then? I mean, I know you had that time slide, but maybe you can just answer that part quickly. But then also, what do you estimate the cost was to Duke to do something like this, besides, of course, all these people hours going into this?
Well, it's clearly 2 years. I mean, I would say even doing the from term sheet to contract was well over a year and a half. We are very fortunate that we have excellent in-house counsel, both at the health system and university wide. And so we had outside counsel a bit, but I don't think it was a huge expense. Most of the heavy lifting was done by you know, counsel. I spent a lot of time on certain aspects of it, but we did have, you know, there are certain outside counsels that are really good at specific data type documents. So not a whole huge amount of expense in doing the negotiation, but a lot of time and a lot of people time. I mean, there were weeks where I felt like all I was doing, and I know our inside counsel felt like all they were doing was this deal.
Okay. Couple more questions. Was IRB a part of the steering committee?
The IRB will get involved when people want to use the data in the platform. So there is IRB if you're a clinician and you want to access the data, just like it, which is no different than if you wanted to access the data that we have now, the IRB can get approved. I think there may have been people in some of those in the ethics committee that were involved in the IRB, but this wasn't like an IRB approval, because this is a, for lack of a better term, a master license contract. The individual projects, you know, will be different.
Okay. Let's talk about the patient data then. Did that have to be consented, and how about retrospectively for the data?
So this is right now, most of the data that's going in is EHR and like pathology slides from, not from research, more from patient care. So if any of you have had the misfortune of going into a hospital, you have to sign, when you go to the hospital, you sign a consent form at the beginning. So, but certainly our data, what do you call it? I'm going to blank on the data safety committee, but the chief compliance, it's not her title, the chief compliance officer, whatever, was involved in all of this to make sure that our, you know, consent forms, and there, if you notice, there is a possibility to opt out going forward. But looking at the way our clinical consents are, as additional data gets proposed to be added to the system, you know, we'll continue to have to look at what the consents are. But again, as a reminder, the only data that's going out is de-identified. No identifiable data will come out, will be able to go out of this system.
So you actually led nicely into the next question. It's, do you have a decision-making process with your industry contracts office as to when an individual PI can work directly with a company versus go through this particular process?
If they want to work with a company, it is going to have to go through an approval process. Generally, if say Pfizer wants to access data, they're going to go through Inference. So it would be more if a faculty member had some sort of project that they wanted to work with a company and you access the data, it would have to get approved. And for sure, the data would not go out to the industry partner, except, you know, through this inference thing. We can license data, but then there's a revenue share with inference as well.
Okay. So a couple of other kind of questions about, how this works with relation to other things. Were there any existing data efforts underway at Duke that were seen as potentially redundant, and how were those conversations navigated around that?
Well, of course, we have, biorepositories, and we have other, all sorts of compendiums of data. I wouldn't say that nothing as massive as this, no third party that was going to come in and spend the investment to do the, the digitization and the de-identification. But as time goes on, I mean, this is a long-term partnership. As time goes on, there's no question that there will be additional data that may or may not go into the FCAP. And there's already been, Inference is well aware of pockets of data that exist at Duke, and it may get added, it may not. This is all part of what the steering committee would do.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask 3 more minutes of questions, and we're going to move to Nila so that we get plenty of time for her. There are a lot coming in. Were there any North Carolina state law or policy considerations versus, or also federal laws and policy considerations that you had to bring into this? I imagine that was one of these subcommittees was actually dealing with this, but were there?
I think that would, the legal, I'm trying to remember, North Carolina, and don't hold me this, I can't remember if we are silent on ownership. I mean, I think there's no question that Duke owns the data, and unlike some other states where there's some sort of question, but I think that's where they used outside counsel for some of the regulatory, and I can't it's a long contract, and I did not negotiate the entire contract.
Okay, well,
I'm sure there's some language in there about federal laws and stuff like that.
Right. How is tech transfer involved, and do they do the data use license?
Well, there's no data. I mean, this is done.
Right.
Right, so we were involved in aspects of, I'm on the steering committee. I think I was in both the finance and the legal committee. So we were very involved in the early days when the initial term sheets were getting done. We were very involved in a lot of the discussions about the financial terms. And then at the end of the day, reviewing the final contract, working with legal. But, the pieces that I was looking at were not the whole thing, of course.
Can industry partners access genomics data through the platform?
I'm not sure what the question was.
Industry partners access genomics data through the platform.
As long as it's de-identified, yeah. If it's in the FCAP, they'll be able to access again through inference.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Okay. If a patient participated in a clinical trial and received SOC at Duke, does the system include the clinical trial data also, or is that carved out due to potential, I think CI conflict of interest or something else, et cetera?
Well, I think this is mostly right now patient care data.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. It's going to be a combination of digitization of images and EHR and it's all that kind of data. I'm not really sure how to answer that. I think this is still early days in what's going to be included. There is a very long list of appendices and inclusions and exclusions. And again, we're still in the early days of just starting which components of the data is going into the FCAP. And then, like I said, starting with the pathology slides, starting with a few other groups of tissue samples and other EHR data. And then over time, I suspect additional things will be added, but it's not like it's all going to happen instantly. If any of you have been part of this takes a lot of time to get this stuff digitized.
Yeah. So I'm going to pause there. We still do have a number of questions, Rob, and I might actually ask you those as Neil is talking. Maybe we can answer those offline with some of the folks. But we're going to move on to, sorry to make you go forward, Katie, thank you, to Nila and her slides, because I know we're going to get some more questions about that as well. And I'll work on the meantime on the others parts. So Nila, please go ahead.
Hi, Glad to be with you here today. I think maybe one of the things to differentiate about kind of who we are is to let you know a little bit about who Baptist Health South Florida is. So our program was started in October of 2019. Mark Katikia came from Henry Ford Health System, where he was for nearly a decade, leading initiatives there and doing similar kinds of things. And I joined him in March of 2020. Next slide. So we have at our roots, what we did was from the top of the company, and we looked at the mission first, which was the fact that our roots are in a community hospital and that we're trying to serve our community through research and innovation. And that was kind of the genesis of what we were doing. Next slide. And our Baptist Health Innovations mission is to engineer the future of healthcare. So when we came, we were looking at who are we? We have 27,000 employees. We have 1.8 million patient visits per year. And our location is from Key West to near West Palm Beach. What's unique about our system is actually the demographics that we serve. So in South Florida, high concentration of Hispanic population, and that population is really multicultural and many races. So we have South Americans, we have Caribbean, we have Spanish from Europe. And that is pretty important as you look at how do you democratize the care and how do you make sure that the solutions that we have, especially in the area of healthcare IT, has representatives from a lot of different and diverse backgrounds. In our system, we have really 4 areas of excellence that we've been concentrating on: cancer, cardiovascular, neuroscience, and orthopedics and sports medicine. A fun thing about our system is that we represent a lot of the teams in Miami. So we have the Heat, we have the Panthers, we have the Messi now with our soccer team, football to those of you who are from Europe. But anyways, so we serve them in our ortho capacity and in other capacity. So we can have diversity even from that data set where we have the older population in South Florida, as well as the younger athletes and also professionals. BHSF has grown from a community hospital and acquired different hospitals. And through that process, we've grown. And so you can imagine that each hospital has a CEO, a board of trustees, and even some of our hospitals are currently undergoing transitions because they have different electronic health systems. So in the 3 years that we've been here, there's been a lot of change in that regard. And we even had a physical data facility. So in that time, we've gone from the physical data facility to data that is also in the cloud in that migration. So next slide, please. So some of this, the approach is very similar in some ways to what Duke's story is, although we've kind of looked at small pieces and worked within from the executives first with the policy and what we're doing. And we report up through the chief administrative officer. So IT, we call it technology, and digital, legal, and innovations is all under the same leadership. The first opportunity that we had was really in being able to care for our patients better and using personalized medicine with a company called Coda. And really a lot of this starts with our subject matter experts in the areas. And this one would be Dr. Leonard Kalman, who we were working with. So he was already working with this company to try to get better visibility, develop some analytical tools, and provide better data and care for his patients. So in this, we license know-how as well as the data to help for cancer care and FDA approvals in being able to take our population, as many of the systems and also drug companies and other translational research type opportunities have needed the diversity of patients to validate some of their clinical trials. So we were able to use this. We look at this as sharing the risk. So there is a revenue share or a royalty that we have in this regard. Next slide. Next slide.
It's on the clearly slide now.
I'm
for
sorry.
us.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The next opportunity we had was with a company called Clearly, which is an AI company in heart disease. And this one was really about images, and we use coronary CT scans. What was interesting is that we have a study called the Miami Heart Study. It was about 2,400 asymptomatic patients that were examined, and everyone got CT scans. And what we did was we used these images for this product in collaboration and a license with them. The data was de-identified, and the tool does two things. Right now, the Clearly tool actually will provide a report for those who, and it gives more explanation, very easy to understand for those using the tool on what the CTA means actually. And we're working with Clearly on a benchmark product. So you're able to track what the progression is and how you compare to others. Why is this important? Because our population is predominantly Hispanic, and there's a high correlation with heart disease. So being able to have these kinds of tools helps us help our patients better. And so in both CODA and Clearly, we also, after we worked with them, did an investment in them, and we get a royalty in this case as well. Next slide. The next opportunity we had was with the company Fujitsu, which I'm sure a lot of you know. They're very good in technology. They actually had a product that was fit for the Canadian market in surgical scheduling optimization. And they wanted to find an opportunity in the US. The problem in Canada is really different than the problem that exists in the US. So we constructed an opportunity where we had a collaboration as well as a license agreement. We had support from the CEO of one of our hospitals, Doctors Hospitals, and also we had a VP of surgical services who participated with us on this. In this particular case, we had a lot of sessions where we went through, and this is part of the digitization that's no different than really what Robin's talking about in our services, and went over all the processes of how surgical scheduling is done within this particular unit at this hospital. The hospital actually has an ASC and also the hospital, so we were looking and comparing and contrasting. And it's mostly orthopedics, but what we did was then they were learning about the know-how that we had in terms of how we set up the scheduling, and then there was also a data piece. So the BAA is always the first part of doing any of these data shares for de-identified data. But what we didn't know was what was the amount of data and what were the records. And we always try to minimize what that looks like in this particular case, because we were just doing scheduling, we found we just needed to index the patient as it went through the process. So anything other than the fact that there is one patient and also that there is a particular surgery that's happening. But most of the data that was looked at in this particular case was just really the surgical services that were provided. When were the wheels into the surgery and when did they go out? And anything around that. So again, it's a royalty as a result of the collaboration. Next slide. This is really pre-opportunity. It's one of the other sets we're curating. It has to do with the combination of sleep and its effect on cardiovascular disease. And we're working with a physician within our Cardiovascular Institute. And in this particular case, what's interesting, to speak to some of what Robin was saying, is when you looked at the patient data, we found that there was a certain data set, which were reports from sleep tests, that were actually in a PDF and needed to be extracted. So you're not getting all the data you need for some of these studies, and additional tools were needed to be able to utilize and really capture what needed to be done. In this case, this particular project is also part of improvement and to our patients, but also looking at it from a research perspective, and is currently going through IRB review. Next slide. So I think the idea that the Duke presents, having a large repository, is always the best scenario. And we're looking at doing this as much as we can with just the cardiovascular data that we have. We have a really strong relationship with the ecosystem in Israel, and we have an investment that we made in TriVentures, which is a Silicon Valley and Israeli fund. So a lot of the due diligence is from our trusted and strategic partners. And this is one of their portfolio companies that actually has a platform that connects healthcare partners and allows accessibility to data. And the first indication that we're looking at is our cardiology data. In this particular instance, we are starting to be able to put the data in there and also extract unstructured data from reports, like in the prior example, so that we can have a full vision of what we need in cardiac care and provide better care for our patients. We do the licenses directly, so we don't look at data use agreements. We actually do data licenses if there are companies, and all of the data is curated through our office. And we share revenues two different ways with each other. Links can bring companies to us, and we can bring our own companies, and there's a data share on both sides of that transaction. So we're the ones that do the license directly. Next slide. So one of the lessons in this is, if you're a hospital, you're probably already giving away your data. One of the things that we had to do is we have a group, and we started looking through different areas. One is in supply chain procurement, and the other was in research, which for us is more clinical trials. We aspire to be an academic medical center, and we have a relationship with Florida International University, but it's very early days in that relationship. And there are a lot of different elements where there are data clauses that are pretty technical. And so those are with service contractors, some of the doctors are almost companies, and they're backed by private equity, and they have their own arrangements with companies. So these can get to be pretty complex. There's numerous product vendors, and there are also various third parties that de-identify data because of the way that we've been constructed. So as you know, the devil is always in the details. Part of this journey has been raising awareness and closing the leaks in these kinds of contracts. Next slide. We have the same. We had legal review, which was our external part of our group, legal counsel with IPN transactions. We have an internal general counsel group, and we had external counsel look at this as well. We only do non-exclusive licenses of de-identified data. There's a lot of due diligence, and in the due diligence you saw that there has to be a subject matter expert, usually from the clinical enterprise, and these are all companies that are from our sphere of influence and also strategic partners. Interestingly, the IT group we've developed a really strong relationship with as well. We have a pretty systematic process. It's a huge group. They have an emerging technology group. So every opportunity or project we have goes through this group. We meet monthly. And then they have a variety of different processes. Could be architectural design, security review, de-identification, and they're all done in concert with this group that oversees everything. And the idea would be eventually to have things in a data lake, but we have a data warehouse that has some data from the EHR, but not all. So it's a process. It all takes a long time. The last thing I'll say about agreements, one, it always begins with the BAA. We really don't negotiate those agreements. They're pretty much intact. Royalties share the risk. And in that, you know, our group comes from Carnegie Mellon. Mark and I worked together 20 years ago at Carnegie Mellon. And so a lot of the concepts are similar to software licensing, where you really need to think what the royalty basis is. Is it auditable? Is it simple? And you consider also the services that are products and services and how that could be gamed at times. And so those have to be considered, as well as the business model and what is actually allowed in the agreement. The scope is really important. A lot of times this is called field of use, and sometimes even derivatives plays a role, and there are definitions of derivatives that has to do with data and what happens to data once it's curated. So those are the top suggestions I have as you're going forward in this. You know, if I can answer any questions.
Yes, definitely. And so first of all, I just want to concentrate on this slide really quickly, because to me, this slide is a great summary, honestly, of the things that we covered in the first three webinars in this series. But is, you know, like a practical use of how Baptist Health is actually tackling its patient data, and making it, you know, more widely available, such that it is then producing these products that is going to help further patients, right? And so I love that, and I love all your examples with regards to showing actually what is happening with the data. But also, I think that what your examples showed is this is not a one-size-fits-all type of thing. You really have to look at, okay, what is it I am actually dealing with here? What is the end use of this? How do we get ourselves there in a way that works for everyone, and, you know, puts everyone in the right place. So a couple of questions from the audience that have come in so far. For the Fujitsu one that you mentioned, was the invention piece of that coming from Baptist Health, from Fujitsu, or both parties? And then are patents involved?
There were intellectual contributions from both sides. I'm not sure if there's patents from the Fujitsu side, but there definitely is know-how and data that were provided from Baptist.
Great, thanks. Next question. From another audience member. They're curious about your insurance limits considering with respect to de-identified data licensing and any general limit ranges. And do you require specifically cybersecurity insurance? Do you know about that?
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
I'll have to check both the BAA and the agreements. The BAA has a lot more of that kind of information.
Right. And so I would suggest to this person to maybe follow up with Nila directly afterwards. So, all right. Next one. Can you comment more? Because I also think it's an interesting term on data lake and what that means and how you're using it.
So I just got a text from one of the companies I work with, and they say, yes, you do. So we do have those items in our agreements.
Okay.
I think data lake is this term of this concept that you have everything in this lake that you can imagine, and you're going towards this, where in my mind, anytime we did an innovation deal with data, you'd have everything in one place. So because you knew that at least one party was interested in the data set, there's multiple parties that are interested as well. And there's a lot of different angles in this, as we explore what can be done that can happen. And so the data lake, I think, is a jargon term that could be the same as what Robin is showing, but it's basically a place where the data sits. And for me, we've started this with the different data sets. We have a data warehouse, which is part of the AHR, but there's so many other data pieces that are important. Raman talked about the pathology slides. We talked about sleep studies. And as you look at these and extract some of these tools, these will be part of a bigger set of data that will be accessible and are found useful, or maybe not found useful, but are at least extracted and put into a place where they can be accessed by not just the company, but really by us. And I think part of it is, as a system, really being able to access and provide the best care by having the data all in one place.
I would say data lake is commonly used. Sometimes we hear a sandbox. Most health systems have a place where their clinicians or their faculty, where all that data is pooled, and there's different ways that they can get access to it. We actually have a separate committee that reviews all the different people that want to access, say they've got an algorithm or tool they want to test and use, a subset of the data. There's processes to do that. But yeah, data lake is a pretty common.
Great. Thank you both. I know that we have people who have varying experiences with regards to patient data and how it's potentially being put together, de-identified, used, et cetera. So appreciate them and answer to all the questions. We are actually going to go to the last slide now, which actually shows the contact information. Hopefully we have it on there correctly for our panelists. So if you do have any further follow-up questions for them, feel free to reach out to them, and they can answer your questions regarding these particular case studies, those that they're actually able to answer with public information. I would like to thank very much our panelists for coming and talking with us about these case studies. We know that this is an area that a lot of people are trying to figure out, how do we do this? And so hopefully these were some pretty practical examples of how institutions are handling patient data, types of agreements, and hopefully it was something that you could take from and be able to hopefully use at your own institution then as well. Robin, Nila, thank you so much for taking the time to put these slides together, talk about your experiences. We greatly appreciate your sharing this information, which we know is not always the easiest thing to share when you're talking about agreements with companies. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you to our audience for writing in as well, and providing all of the questions that you did throughout today, and for listening to this particular series. Don't forget about the last part of our webinar series that's coming up next week on our Q&A. So join us for that next time. Thank you so much, everyone.